Welcome back to the Midnight Fire. Tonight we gather around the embers once more to share a story that whispers from the salt-sprayed cliffs and the churning gray sea. It's a tale of a forgotten village, a grim tradition, and the price of survival when the ocean demands its due. Settle in and let the shadows lengthen. We call this story The Ritual of the Red Harvest. The village of Port Blossom clings to the jagged coastline like a stubborn barnacle. To outsiders, it's a picturesque hamlet, a postcard of colorful houses and lobster traps stacked high on weathered docks. But for those born within its salty embrace, Port Blossom is a cage, a beautiful, inescapable cage ruled by the tides and an ancient, unspoken pact. Every family knows the stories passed down not in books, but in hushed tones over crackling fires, in the sad eyes of the grandmothers, and in the bitter winds that howl through the crooked alleyways. They speak of the hunger, a deep, insatiable gnawing that rises from the sea when the harvest is lean and the nets come up empty. And they speak of the only thing that can appease it, the red harvest. Our story begins with Elara, a young woman with eyes the color of a stormy sea and a spirit as untamed as the gulls that cry overhead. Unlike the others in Port Blossom, who walk with their shoulders hunched against a perpetual dread, Elara carries a spark of defiance. She never understood the fear that clung to the village like a persistent sea fog. She saw the ocean not as a hungry god, but as a provider, a source of life. Her father, a fisherman named Silas, had tried to instill the old ways in her, his face grim, his voice a low rumble. "The sea gives, Elara," he'd say, mending his nets with calloused hands, "but it also takes. We must honor the balance." Elara would just scoff, her youthful arrogance a shield against the village's suffocating traditions. To her, the ritual of the red harvest was a barbaric relic, a ghost story to scare children. She was about to learn how real ghosts can be. The year had been cruel. The summer sun was a pale, watery disk in a perpetually overcast sky. The fish, once plentiful, seemed to vanish from the coastal waters. Nets were hauled in, dripping and empty, day after day. A quiet panic began to settle over Port Blossom. The larders grew bare, the faces of the villagers gaunt. The children's laughter, once a common sound on the cobbled streets, faded into an eerie silence. It was then that the elder, a man named Corwin, whose skin was as wrinkled as a nautical chart, called the village to the square. His voice, though frail, carried the weight of generations. He announced that the hunger had returned. The sea was starving, and soon so would they. The time had come. The ritual of the red harvest must be performed. A chilling stillness fell over the crowd. The ritual was simple in its design, yet monstrous in its implication. One person, chosen by lot, would be given to the sea, a sacrifice to appease the hunger and ensure the return of the fish. The chosen would be rowed out to the jagged rocks known as the mariner's teeth during the highest tide of the autumn equinox and left for the ocean to claim. This was the dark secret that held Port Blossom together, the blood price for its continued existence. Elara watched in horror as the ancient wooden box containing the lots was brought forth. Each family head was forced to draw a smooth black stone from a velvet bag. One of those stones was marked with a single crimson dot. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs. She looked at her father, Silas, his face a mask of stone. He had always been a pillar of strength, but now she saw the deep-seated terror in his eyes, a terror he had hidden from her all her life. The drawing began. One by one, the men stepped forward. their hands trembling as they reached into the bag. One by one they revealed unmarked black stones, their faces flooding with a guilty, gut-wrenching relief. Then it was Silas's turn. He walked to the box, his steps heavy. He plunged his hand into the bag and pulled out a stone. As he opened his palm, a collective gasp swept through the crowd. There, stark against the black stone, was the single bloody dot. Time seemed to freeze. The world narrowed to the sight of that crimson mark. Elara's defiant spirit shattered. This wasn't a story. This wasn't a myth. This was her father, her rock, her entire world, condemned to the cold embrace of the sea. A primal scream tore from her throat, but it was lost in the rising murmur of the crowd. The ritual was law. The sacrifice was chosen. There was no appeal, no escape. The date was set for the next high tide, just 3 days away. Those 3 days were a living nightmare. Silas was confined to their cottage, a guard posted at the door. He wasn't a prisoner to be punished, but a sacred offering to be protected. The village began to prepare. They weren't mourning. They were celebrating. A feast was planned. There was an air of grim festivity, a desperate hope that this sacrifice would finally end their suffering. Elara was an outcast in her own home. The villagers who had known her since birth now looked at her with a mixture of pity and fear, as if she were already a ghost. She tried to reason with Elder Corwin, begging him to stop the madness. "It's a superstition," she cried, her voice raw. "There has to be another way." Corwin's eyes, ancient and weary, held no comfort. "This is the only way it has ever been," he said softly. "The sea demands its price. We pay it so the rest of us may live." Desperate, Elara tried to formulate a plan to free her father, but the cottage was watched day and night. The entire village was her jailer, their collective belief a wall she could not break. On the final night she was allowed to see him. Silas sat by the cold hearth, his face strangely calm. He held her hand, his touch firm. "Do not weep for me, my little Gaul," he whispered. "This is my duty. You must live. You must survive. But promise me one thing. When the fish return, leave this place. Do not let this village swallow your soul as it has swallowed mine." The morning of the equinox dawned gray and foreboding. The sea was a churning cauldron of black water, foam crashing against the rocks. The entire village gathered at the shore as Silas was led to a small, solitary dory. He didn't struggle. He walked with a quiet dignity that broke Elara's heart. As they pushed the boat into the surf, Elara broke free from the crowd, running into the freezing water, screaming his name. 2 fishermen grabbed her, holding her back as the dory carrying her father became a smaller and smaller speck, heading towards the jagged spires of the Mariner's Teeth. She fought and kicked, but it was useless. She was forced to watch as the man who gave her life was rowed toward his death. As the dory disappeared into the mist surrounding the rocks, a strange thing happened. The wind died down. The churning sea grew calm, almost placid. And then a villager shouted, pointing to the water. A silver shimmer appeared just beyond the breakers. Then another and another. It was a school of herring, larger than anyone had seen in years. A collective cheer erupted from the crowd. The sacrifice had been accepted. The hunger was appeased. The red harvest was a success. They turned from the sea, their faces lit with joyous relief, ready for the feast. But Elara did not cheer. She stood shivering in the surf, staring out at the Mariner's Teeth, her grief a cold, hard knot in her chest. The joy of the villagers felt like a physical blow. They were celebrating her father's murder. As they dragged their boats to the water, eager to claim the sea's bounty, she looked at their smiling faces and saw only monsters. In that moment, Silas's last words echoed in her mind. Leave this place. The pact was fulfilled, but it was a pact made with a devil, not a god. As the fishing boats launched, their nets already filling with the silver bounty, Elara turned her back on the village of Port Blossom. She didn't pack a bag or say goodbye. She just walked away following the coastal path, not looking back. She didn't know where she was going, only that she was leaving the rot and the madness behind. She walked until the sounds of the celebrating village faded, replaced by the cry of the gulls and the steady rhythm of the waves. The sea had taken her father, and in return, it had given her a reason to be free. She was the last of her line, carrying the weight of the red harvest, not as a blessing, but as a curse. And as she walked towards the unknown horizon, she made a new vow. She would survive, and she would never, ever forget the price that was paid in the cold, hungry waters off Port Blossom. Thank you for joining us around the fire tonight. The story of the red harvest is a reminder that some traditions are not born of wisdom, but of desperation, and the deepest horrors can be found not in the monsters of the deep, but in the choices we make to survive. Be sure to subscribe and douse the notification bell so you don't miss our next tale. Until then, stay safe and try not to listen too closely to the whispers on the wind. Good night.